dramatists and writers and artists pry our line of sight off of our feet and put it back up on the horizon so we can see further ahead and make broader, better decisions.
I can't help myself, but when I see something, wonder where it comes from.
What's the point of teaching humanities if you then ask your students to be silenced?
History is never over, and the people who say history is finished are always up to something bad.
The job is on us to imagine what the next best world looks like and to work towards it.
Good afternoon. I'm Bernard Schwartz. I run literary programs at the Authors Guild Foundation. Thank you. Welcome to the closing session of the 2025 WIT Festival, a conversation between Bishop Mariann Edgar Budde and Marilynne Robinson, moderated by Paul Eli. I also wanted to welcome the audience watching via live stream, thanks to a partnership with CTSB, Community Television for the Southern Berkshires. This afternoon's live stream is co-presented by Commonweal magazine, where we hope to publish a transcript of the conversation in coming weeks. Since it is the final session of WIT 2025, I also want to thank Hunter K. Ronette and the entire WIT committee, our generous supporters, and especially my colleagues at the Authors Guild Foundation, Deborah, Nikki, Lizzie, Sophie, and Ben, without whom none of this would be possible. Or, put another way, with whom anything is possible. This afternoon's conversation will last about an hour, followed by audience questions and a book signing. If you have a question, please form a line at the microphone at the front of the aisle just here. And if you're interested in getting a book signed, please stay here in the theater until the ushers are able to form that line. As I said the other night, since the beginning, the WIT Festival has been blessed with two superpowers. Our first is you all, the WIT community. It's your belief in the idea and vision and possibility of the festival that is a sustaining source of inspiration and motivation. You keep showing up. Our second superpower is that WIT amplifies and embodies the advocacy efforts of the Authors Guild and its foundation, organizations that have been showing up for writers for more than a century. As Rachel Maddow said in the video, it's the writer's job to pry our line of sight off our feet and put it back on the horizon so we can see further ahead and make broader, better decisions. And it's the job of the Authors Guild and Authors Guild Foundation to have their backs while they're doing it. We fight for free speech and fair pay and stronger copyright provisions. We fight against the silencing of voices who are seen as a threat to those in power. And what an immense privilege to have those voices here with us this weekend. If WIT has superpowers, then surely we must have a superhero in our midst. And of course we do. It's Mary Rassenberger, CEO of the Authors Guild and Authors Guild Foundation, our fearless and tireless leader. I'm delighted that Mary is here to introduce this session. Please welcome Mary Rassenberger.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is so good to see so many people here for our last event of the weekend. We are so lucky to have two incredible luminaries here with us this afternoon, Bishop Mariann Budde and novelist Marilynne Robinson, in conversation with Paul Eli. So we spent a lot of this weekend, I don't know how many of you have been through the whole weekend, but you even know from this morning, we've been talking about the growing tyranny and attacks on democracy in the U.S., trying to understand how our values, how democracy could be turned upside down so quickly. And we've been asking one another, what can we do? What can we do now? Can we do to help, and how can we keep hope? This morning, David Blight and Deval Patrick gave us some excellent advice on the kinds of actions we can be taking now. We're about to hear from Bishop Budde and Marilynne Robinson, who no doubt will give us reason to hope in their discussion on spirituality, community, and courage. Bishop Budde often speaks of the role of hope. She said recently in her newsletter, "We'd be made of stone if we didn't feel discouraged some days and deeply saddened by what we see around us. But remember that hope isn't something we need to conjure on our own." Then she continues, "We are the ones who must dare to believe that the seeds of new possibilities, invisible to us now, have already been planted in the soil of our lives, and they are slowly taking root. New life will emerge from the ashes of what is lost." Marilynne is one of our most spiritual, beautiful novelists of today. She is my personal favorite, so I am awed to be introducing her. She writes prose as poetry. She brings thoughts, emotions, and ideas out of the shadows, things we don't have words for. She puts into words somehow. Marilynne has spoken about democracy as imaginative love for those we do not love, and I love that way of thinking about democracy. It's probably the best definition I've ever heard. She says, democracy is in essence and genius is imaginative love for an identification with the community with which much of the time, in many ways, one may be in profound disagreement. So without empathy for those we don't know, we start running into tyranny. Reading is one of the ways we develop empathy for those we don't know, of course, as is spiritual practice. And Mariann has also said that fiction may be, whatever else, an exercise in the capacity for imaginative love or sympathy or identification. In today's New York Times, I just want to make sure everyone saw, there's a wonderful interview with Marilynne, and I highly recommend it, but I'll let her tell you about it. Before I step aside, I have been instructed to say a few words about the Authors Guild and our work. The Authors Guild exists to support the literary profession, to keep our literary culture strong, robust, and abundant. And the Authors Guild Foundation, the host of WIT, of this whole festival, funds much of our advocacy and our education for authors. Our strategy today is to fight back through litigation and grassroots advocacy, and we are focusing very much on upholding free speech. We believe that as long as we can protect free speech, we can protect democracy. And believe it or not, the rule of law does still exist, and the legal system and the law are mostly holding up. Lawsuits are slow, but they are working. We are plaintiffs in 9 lawsuits around the country. We have taken on laws and policies that require books to be banned in an attempt to erase Black history, Native history, and LGBTQ identities. So far, the good news is that we have won every case. And we have, it's awesome. The rule of law is holding up in the courts. We've won these cases because the fact is that we do have strong free speech laws in this country. And even conservative judges appointed by Trump, have ruled that book banning laws violate free speech principles. And their decisions are so good, so solid, that they are making for even stronger free speech law going forward. So we also, as many of you know, we sued the government when NEH pulled back the current grants that writers were relying on. They had taken leave from their teaching and other jobs, and their grants were suddenly pulled. We also won there. Again, it was a free speech case. The court held that the government's actions were illegal viewpoint discrimination because they censored work that contained diverse perspectives. We also have been leaders really at the forefront of the fight to ensure that human authorship survives the AI era. and we have sued AI companies. And in fact, right now we're currently working on making sure authors fairly get their share of $1.5 billion that Anthropic is paying out to them. It's awesome. So to finish, our goal at the Authors Guild and the Foundation is to make sure that our literary culture remains abundant, robust, diverse, and rich as it is today. We have to keep fighting for that, though. The Authors Guild has been doing this for 110 years, and we would not have the literary culture that we have today if not for the work of the Authors Guild. We want to make sure that we can continue to promote the free exchange of ideas, learning, and empathy necessary to make democracy work that books provide. So I want to make sure that you know about our work, and I hope that you will consider supporting the Authors Guild Foundation. So now I would like you to join me in welcoming Bishop Mariann Budde and Marilynne Robinson as they discuss courage, community, and how we might tend the human spirit with Paul Elie. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Elie. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to Bernard Schwartz and the Authors Guild Foundation for the festival in general, but also for the very specific event, I guess you can call it, that we're about to begin. I just learned this morning that the two of you, Bishop Mariann and Marilynne, have met for the first time only this weekend. And for that alone, we have the festival and the Authors Guild Foundation to thank. Marilynne, you and I were talking a few minutes ago about the time when President Barack Obama engaged you in a two-part conversation published in the New York Review of Books. And you said, it feels like a long time ago. This January, Bishop Mariann, you engaged with the present president, and I'm not sure whether to say that feels like a long time ago or feels like yesterday, but you've been asked many times, but I wonder if we could begin with my asking you to relate again what considerations you brought to the occasion that you had to put the question of mercy to the president.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I was given the assignment to preach long before the election results were in. And the theme of the service was a service for healing for the nation after the bruising and divisive political campaign season. And so I was working on the foundations of unity for a long time in my mind, worried as a preacher of the consequences of preaching to a congregation, perhaps a country that had been barreling down the road of division for so long that prayers for unity felt perhaps a bit disingenuous if we weren't clear what unity requires. And so that's where I started. And like most speeches, I worked a lot longer on the parts that nobody remembers. But they really meant a lot to me. And the headline would be that contempt is no way to run a country, right? That you can, and that if we don't have an appreciation for the dignity of every human being, if we don't recognize that unity is not partisan, or can be coerced, or is the result of passive resignation, if we aren't willing to be honest in our public and private speech, and if we don't have a modicum of humility, all of our prayers for unity would be almost blasphemous, because we are praying for something we have no intention of working on ourselves. The mercy component came toward the end, and it was as a result of a number of conversations and also watching the day before the inauguration itself, when I heard the now President Trump rehearsing again all of the really terrible rhetoric against vulnerable populations in our country. And that felt, I felt a pressure both to speak to humanize groups of people who were being totally dehumanized, and also to use a mechanism that is customary in the pulpit, which is to address the thing that everybody knows but doesn't want to know, number one, and number two, to offer a gentle exhortation. But given I was speaking to the most powerful man in the world, I chose the vehicle of a plea for mercy, recognizing that he believed himself to be spared by God to lead this country. So that's what I was thinking. But it was twofold: to bring people into the conversation that everyone knew were not being accurately portrayed, and whose humanity was at stake. And then also to say, when you have that much power, it's incumbent upon you also to be merciful.
It's striking to me, listening to you just now, I think not so often do we hear the word mercy even used in public discourse, and used repeatedly and without apology in the way that you did and have done. And that's true of so many words that come from the religious vocabulary that, Marilynne, you've made a lingua franca in your work. When we were talking earlier today, I asked you, Bishop Mariann, how you define bravery, and Marilynne, I asked you how that's connected to courage. And what do you know? Each of them, had an immediate, clear, distinct answer. So you've reflected a lot on bravery. Can you share some of those reflections with us, and then we could follow Marilynne?
I think Marilynne should go first this time.
Okay.
Is this on? I think that you're the one that has pondered this question, so I do think that, someone asked me to define courage, and I said, courage liberates all the other virtues. And I was surprised to hear myself say that as if it were a settled opinion, but I think I was saying something true, in the sense that how generous do you feel that you can be? It depends how much courage you have, How can you be fair at your own cost? It takes courage. It takes courage. Can you tell the truth when the truth matters? That takes courage, So I think that we don't perhaps, for some reason, encourage, an interesting word, the development of these sort of classic virtues in ourselves. I don't know why not. But in any case, I think we should. And I think that the more general liberalization or freedom that comes with being able to behave with dignity and to be to not lose equilibrium and so on. These are the consequences of courage, and I think that courage is something that we can develop internally simply by pondering sort of the beauty of it, the consequences of it. And that's basically what I have to say.
I'm often asked if as you said, what I think of the difference between bravery and courage, and the way, and we were talking of this, the way I think of it is that there are times in life when we are called upon, many times in life, when we're called upon to do something we've never done before, or as you said, that requires a risk, a possible loss, of many things. And in that moment, we are invited to be brave, to do something that we didn't think we could do. And over a lifetime, we learn that courage, which is of the heart, is the virtue that results when we become aware that all of life has this summons. It's a brilliant aspect of the human experience, this summons to call us out of ourselves to something that beckons us from a horizon or a deep interiority. And that I can always tell when it's inside, maybe you all do too, you've got that physical sensation when you know it's happening, like right now. And it's happening now, and it's time to act or not to act, to speak or not to speak. But the sensation is I am moving beyond where I am to someplace else. And I just wanted to normalize that, and also to say that we learn this. It's a learned trait, and we can get better at it as we practice.
So courage is a learned trait, but courage is not sufficiently encouraged. What happened? How has that come to be?
I think that we went through a phase of thinking where, I mean, it was kind of an optimism that we hated to give up on, which is the idea that if you sort of just leave people alone and don't try to instruct them in the ways that people have traditionally been instructed, that they would simply flower into well-developed, fully capable human beings. But in fact, culture is as profoundly human as breathing, And I think that something that you see a lot now is the kind of loneliness that people experience from the fact that they have not been given the whole tapestry of what is meaningful and what is admirable and so on. It's as if it's an aspect of this kind of cynicism that pervades so much that it would be naive or disingenuous to try to teach people honesty, courage, the things that good people have taught historically. I think that we made a kind of Rousseauvian experiment, and we found out that people need more cultural context and matrix and support than we have perhaps been giving them. It sounds naive now to talk about being an honest person, being a courageous person, but those are exactly the people we need. And people have to be able to judge themselves against a meaningful standard of honesty and courage and the rest.
Hearing those words in your mouth, I'm reminded of a short story of Hemingway's from In Our Time. If I'm getting it right, it's something like, words like honesty and courage no longer felt authentic or real, and you couldn't say them. And that was 100 years ago. We all feel the atrophy of older values, but at the same time, aren't we witnessing the emergence of a strong counterforce that wants to deny truth, that wants to deny the kind of courage that the two of you have represented, that want to ridicule it or suggest that there's nothing to it?
Without question. Yes, indeed.
Yes. It's exhausting, actually, to be on the receiving end of that onslaught of deception, and to recognize, and I have my blinders, I have my biases, and so I'm sure there are things that are not evident to me that are equally true. So just to say that. But there does seem to be, and maybe it may seem new to us and amplified by all the forces of technology. And yet, if we look back historically, the human species has been through a lot, and this country has been through a lot. And through it all, there have also been those amazing people that may not have received recognition in their time, but that we look back on and give thanks to God for them because of what they stood for and what they represented. And if anything, we need as much of that as possible right now, just as much as possible to infuse the public space with, as you said in the interview, with beauty and with goodness and with integrity, and trust that that will in the end prevail. I don't know what else to hope for. I mean,
Yeah.
Truth will in the end prevail.
I think we also have to be more willing to respect people when they act well, you know? I think that we have, the way that we talk about most things now, it seems as if we don't represent them truly to ourselves until we have devalued them, you know? And so, you know, someone who tries to do the right thing, say the right thing, you know, it is so easily dismissible in this climate, you know. Well, he must be taking money from somebody or something like that, you know. And so we refuse to signalize the value of a good speech, a good vote, a good, you know, understanding, a good book, for heaven's sake, you know. But those are the people that are trying to create the kind of value that sustains a civilization. And we should give them the benefit of the doubt, if there is any, and we should also be very happy to praise, you know, which is not something that is characteristic of us now.
There's one particular quality in the range that you're referring to that you've given some attention, Bishop Mariann, and you surprised me by telling me that you've been reading books on toxic empathy. So here's empathy, which is a virtue by most traditional accounts, and now it's being turned into something else. What's happening? So that empathetic behavior is not credited in the way that you're saying, Marilynne. It's denounced.
It's a more nuanced argument than that title would suggest, and I think that's worth saying. The overall thrust, as I understand it, and I'm not finished yet. The overall thrust, as I understand it, is that it is a good thing that can be corrupted. I mean, that's basically the argument, and that empathy is that empathy risks over-identification and thus a sacrifice of moral principle or your understanding of the good. And so it's kind of like the analogy that's used several times. It's someone's in the water drowning, and rather than standing on the edge and helping them up, you're jumping in and drowning with them. I think that's the overall argument. I think it's kind of one of those arguments that first it's a false premise and then it's shot down, right? And so I don't, on some level, it's like when people tell me they don't believe in God and I ask them to tell me about the God they don't believe in, and I don't believe in that God either, right? You know, so it's a similar way. It's like, well, that's not, but it's become a mechanism to critique those of us who choose solidarity. It's really a way to say, and it's often the way we might want to characterize, and I'm guilty of this, we might want to characterize the whole alternate right or alt-right, whatever we call it. There is this other side that is denouncing everything that's on the extreme left or the progressive agenda, right? But it's a caricature of us, those of us who stand proudly in that tradition. It's a caricature that is then argued with. And I just want to say the caricature isn't right. And the understanding of empathy is simplistic or is extreme to the point where no one would agree with it, and then to critique it. Does that make sense? But I also think it becomes then a catchword that allows people to say, if you're sympathetic to gay marriage or LGBTQ rights in general, because that is obviously not biblical, then you fall into the prey of toxic empathy. But the premise is their position on human sexuality that that I don't share. Does that make sense? That's the best I can do. And so I'm finding myself not wanting to have the conversation anymore, but to simply say it's a false premise. It's a false premise. And maybe to hold up genuine mercy and examples of mercy and leave it at that.
Well, I don't want to get in the way of the two of you engaging with each other directly, but what you said about the false premise reminds me of what I think of as a central theme of your nonfiction, especially Marilynne, which is that Christianity is oversimplified and caricatured and then rejected, and then we wonder why it no longer has a sufficient presence to buttress the virtues and service the ties that bind and so forth. A drastic oversimplification on my own part, but there's something there in your work that runs along those lines. Isn't that right?
True. I mean, it's one of the things that's amazing to me about the people that might be considered the guarantors, the protectors of value, and I think the people with strong democratic feelings, and using that in the, with the little d. But that group of people, for some reason, are very easily put on the defensive and made to feel as if, for example, Christianity is a kind of embarrassment because there are people that draw pictures of arcs with giraffe heads sticking out the windows and stuff like that, and I mean, the people that should be the guardians of traditional democracy are continuously backpedaling because somebody has chosen to ridicule something that is perhaps not at all ridiculous, And this is, again, it shouldn't be an issue of courage, but it is. Where people tell you, oh, you can't use the word liberal. That's a bad word now, which was true a few years ago, because Fox News told you it was a bad word. What? I mean, I knew liberal people who would not call themselves by that name because you just don't use that word, Says who? For what reason? Why? What are you sacrificing? Liberal means generous. Isn't that what we want to be? Isn't that how we define our values, So anyway, I think it is true that we can be easily led into completely futile attitudes and leaving things undefended that we should certainly defend, like empathy, for example. I mean, we talk about this as if it were some sort of verbal issue or something, but in fact, it is true all over this country that low-income children have less food support, despite, everything that's been legislated. In Iowa, the governor did not allow the federal government to subsidize school lunches. We have a lot of poverty in Iowa. So this is not somebody ought to have said no, absolutely no, under no circumstances are we going to make our children go hungry. No one says this, because perhaps they think it sounds naive or because they're talking about politics at some other abstract level. It's fair. At USAID, the same thing that was mentioned earlier today, we should be screaming in the streets about the fact that we're allowing people to starve who have trusted us to give them at least minimal sustenance. It's a terrible change we've made with potentially millions of victims. When we talk about the terrible things human race has gone through, we're providing them with the opportunity to go through more terrible things. That should not be, what can I say? Why has this passed so quietly, It's just extraordinary. And of course it's late in the day because we've made concessions and made concessions until we feel that there's nothing left to defend.
Bishop Mariann, you've described some people in your diocese who aren't just letting it go. What are they doing?
Well, there are people everywhere who are not letting it go. And for me, the weaving together of story and community and movement building are absolutely critical now. Far more critical than, I'm grateful for the opportunities to speak, and I will always speak because I want to present an alternative vision of what it means to be a Christian, and kind of what you were saying earlier, Marilynne, about educating people about Jesus and his teachings, which are surprisingly clear on lots of things, and totally ambiguous and silent on others, right? So let's just name that. But at the same time, we need embodied Christianity, embodied compassion. And I was describing earlier today, last week I was at a meeting at one of our churches, and it was a network of people, about 100 people who had gathered for a fundraiser, and every single one of them was working in some way to protect the migrant families in the DC area. And so some were lawyers doing immigrant rights training, some were doing accompaniment, which means actually going with people to their appointments at immigration offices. Others were providing food for families whose main breadwinner had been deported. Still others were walking, in our neighborhood, people are walking children to school because their parents are afraid to walk them to school. So it's just this network, this quiet network of people who are doing everything they can to protect as many people as we can during this assault on the immigrant community in our country. And that feels to me important, that we have a lot to do, as you were saying, about public witness, and I wish I knew how to do that effectively in a way that would turn things around, but in the meantime, or in addition, we have things like Mary was saying earlier, we have institutions that we need to protect, and we have people whose lives are on the line. And that's true internationally as well, and the churches have a lot to do with that. We can't make it up, but we can do as much as we can, both here and globally. So it's a challenging time, but I just feel we have to rise to it. We didn't get to choose that this happened to us, but here we are. And as was said earlier this morning, we can either complain about it or we can try to do something. And that's where I find my hope, in the people who show up.
Marilynne, when you were just describing the situation in Iowa, you said, our children are going hungry. And it's the our children that caught my ear, because your really large and generous sense of community recognize that they're our children. But you've written about the way in which that ceased to be the case, beginning with, and I'll just quote one section from your work, the lack of a theomorphic conception of the person, and the person as an image of God. And those things are somehow connected, that we no longer see them as our children. Isn't that right?
Yes, I think so. I think that in my own strange little corner of Christianity, one of the things that's a very important idea is that since people are images of God, every encounter with another human being is an encounter with God, as a child, as an invalid, as somebody that's come to murder you, all images of God, and then a sort of an absolute obligation follows as a result of that, And of course, people fall short of standards of that kind, but nevertheless, the fact that whenever you're responsible in any way for the well-being of anyone, that is specifically a request or demand that God is making of you. There's no middle territory, really, I think that, like if you read like the old abolitionist writers and people like that they believed that very deeply, that and that was what gave them the great zeal that they had for liberating the enslaved parts of the population. And there's, the idea of educating everyone, bringing everyone to a standard of literacy and so on. The the very highly individual idea that anyone is an image of God generalizes into a great obligation toward the whole population for whom everything, all these things are true, individually and collectively, When you look at the generosity that's been true of this country in its best moments, your feeling of reverence for the idea of the American people, I think we've had a terrible diminution of reverence in all its applications, but certainly in, people. I mean, the idea that people can be redundant, that, well, of course they're suffering because they have no necessary role in the economy, and so on. Blasphemy, blasphemy. You're looking at God in every instance,
I've been positively influenced and inspired by a small and I hope growing movement across the country that is attempting to provide the antidote to contempt in our society. And the only antidote to contempt, according to this schema, is human dignity, to go back to what you were saying, Marilynne. And that we can actually, all of us, every single one of us, we can learn how our language either promotes dignity or slides into contempt. And it's a spectrum, right? It's a spectrum from extremes, Jesus and Gandhi and others at the height, and genocide and violence at the lowest ebb. But most of us sort of hover somewhere around 4 and 5 on this 8-point scale, right? And we have choices that we make every day. Does what I say, what I am saying now, an expression of human dignity, or is it an expression of contempt? And I love it because it holds me accountable to my speech, and it helps me become more careful of how I describe people that I don't understand and I strongly disagree with. And it helps me to practice stating what I believe to be true and not compromising on that, but never doing so in such a way that it violates the human dignity of people who see the world differently. And I am persuaded that that's part of the solution that we need, because if we're going to reweave this country together, we have to find ways to heal or to overcome that reflex to see people in the worst possible terms when we disagree strongly. And I'd like to be part of the solution rather than the problem, even in my daily speech, and then see how that translates into wider action.
One of my favorite Puritan writers, 17th century English, but nevertheless, he said that we are judged twice, once when we die, and once when every word or action of ours has had its final consequence. Isn't that? It makes you think,
The stakes are high.
Exactly. These words we speak, they're not going nowhere. They're going right into history.
Well, I had an instance of, I guess you'd call it road rage on the way here today. I was down at about a 3 on your scale, Bishop Mariann, but I hate to think of the final consequences of that.
I just want to say, it's interesting because, so much has happened in Salt Lake, but one of the things that the Salt Lake City Public School District took on as its own internal mantra for everyone, from students to highest administrators, the 5 and above. And the idea was on this spectrum of 8 grades of dignity, we were going to commit ourselves to strive for dignity in all of our interactions, starting from level 5 statements and moving forward. But again, it was a practice. It was a spiritual, educational, pedagogical, relational practice. I'm going to be an antidote to the contempt that is poisoning so much of our public discourse, and from which a lot of people, some people anyway, are profiting. Like, there are monetizations of our contempt that we are prey to. And someone mentioned that earlier in our conversations, both internally and abroad. And so to be especially mindful that we not unwittingly contribute to the very polarities we bemoan.
So we're describing this situation, the social contempt writ large, and yet we're in a moment in which God talk is everywhere, it seems, in public life. People strutting their Christianity in all sorts of forums. This was the case when President Obama had his conversation with you, Marilynne. He said, why is it that some of the people who were noisiest about religion seem the least appreciative of the virtues that religion historically promotes? And it seems to have gotten worse from then. What explains this paradox, or can it be explained?
Well, it does, Jesus is already dealing with people to whom he says, I never knew you, get behind me, and he's already aware, or of course he would be, of, hypocrisy. Hypocrite is one of his favorite words, But in any case, there is historically a benefit in claiming to be, a member of a dominant group. When these people are talking about America being a Christian country, what they're saying is there is a majority out there, and if we all get together, we can exclude other people from the benefits of life in America, and label this Christian, It's a fraud, but it's a fraud that's been very effective in many, many instances, I remember when I was talking with Obama, and he believed in a kind of incrementalism, the arc of history bending, this sort of thing, and he thought that he was a notch on the arc of incremental democracy, And I think that, it was his faith in the system, and so long as people navigated by faith in the system, that was a fair way to think. But I think that incrementalism was not as responsive as it needed to be of problems in the civilization, and therefore it was overthrown, and that what it had erected, all these reforms and amendments and so on, that put together our very, very particular culture, all of that, it was felt it could be swept away because it didn't tend toward justice, it tended toward, obfuscation and obstacles and so on, I think that partly a problem was that people don't know enough history to understand what painful effort and goodwill and so on have gone on to develop the incremental structures in the United States. And part of it was that they thought it was so strong. They thought that they had to bring enormous pressure against it, when in fact, as soon as people began being disrespectful of it in office and so on, we found out that it was based on ethics and tradition and values of various kinds and a historical memory and so on, that it was delicately constructed. It depended on the Supreme Court. We've certainly learned that, haven't we? The people in the Supreme Court, they used to write decisions that were so beautiful they would be published, and people would recite lines and so on. And look what we have now, And it's because people have not maintained an adequate level of respect for the law, or for the people on the court, for the people who will be put on the court. You know, it's the air has gone out of the whole enterprise because we stopped respecting it. You know? And it was, you know, how pure-heartedly he respected it, and how confident that he was that if we moved forward, you know, and of course, look at history. You know, we certainly are ahead of where we were in 1920, or you know what I mean? We can, when we talk about the populations now that are threatened, we're talking about the populations that have benefited from recent history, you know? So, you know, well, I don't know what to conclude, except that we have to relearn habits of respect and we have to study history. Certainly that's true.
I also want to, and Marilynne, you did this for us this morning at breakfast, but I also want to evoke the power and the presence of God, of a benign, loving presence that infuses the universe and has the capacity to interrupt or to astonish or incarnate in ways that we can't anticipate. And that there are forces for good that we can trust to motivate and inspire us. In other words, it's not all up to us. We don't have to figure all of this out on our own. And it may not be, I say this to myself quite a bit because I certainly know historically and personally people who didn't live to see the dream that God had placed on their hearts, right? We know that to be true. And so maybe we are in a season of retrenchment or collapse as other societies around the world and in history have been through. Okay, if that's the case, here we are. What are we going to do? How can we plant the seeds or protect and sustain and give hope to those coming up behind us to say, it doesn't have to be this way, and we're going to do everything we can to move it forward for as long as we can, but I may not live to see it. I mean, I don't know, but I have to trust that wherever we are in our arc, and it maybe ebbs and flows more than Obama and all of us felt at an earlier time. Well, if that's the time we're in, okay. Well, let's choose this as our destiny then, and live it as bravely as those who lived through the retrenchment after Reconstruction lived theirs, and as you know, as heartbreaking as that whole period must have been. I think about the federal workforce, how it was segregated just by fiat, and how devastating that must have been, or the housing laws that restricted whole movements of people. All those things happened, and it was terrible, and there were consequences, and some people chose to carry on with lives of dignity and resistance and planted the seeds that were realized in subsequent generations. Is that our task now? I don't know. But if that's it, it's not what I would have chosen, it's not what you would have chosen, but if we have to rise to it, all right. And maybe something will happen on our watch or on our children's watch that will surprise us all, you know, like Mandela walking out of prison or something, you know, something that beautiful and astonishing. And that will give us hope, not as a spiritual practice, but a real sense that something beautiful is possible. So that's my pitch for not succumbing to despair in despairing times, because hope is that light shining in the darkness. And if I preach it every Christmas, I have to believe it when the day after election, you know, there's a light shining in the darkness.
What you just said put in mind this morning's discussion, David Blight and Governor Patrick, appealing to the need for imagination. Governor Patrick said, there are slave narratives that imagine me. And Professor Blight spoke of Frederick Douglass and his ability to imagine forward by looking backwards to the stories from the Hebrew Bible. Marilynne, you've devoted yourself to the religious imagination. What specifically can that bring to our circumstances that will enable us to take that longer and deeper view that, as I see it anyway, religion and a recognition of the force of God behind all this, invites us to see.
Well, the specific example that that the governor chose was Frederick Douglass talking about the flood, which doesn't come immediately to mind as an example of what is to be hoped for. But he knew the text and what happens that makes the biblical flood narrative different from all the other versions of, in the ancient Near East, is that there is a new creation as a consequence of the flood, that it becomes like the primal chaos, and after it, God blesses humankind again, and he blesses the earth again. And he says, go, multiply and cover the earth and all this. He says everything that he says to Adam in the first instance, And so if you transform the idea of the flood, which was a borrowed literary idea, but if you think of it as in fact a sort of primal chaos, erasing violence, and giving humanity a new start in a renewed world, then you're talking about a profound narrative of hope, I mean, in order to, you have to know the text in order to know that that is what it is telling you, And it comes back to a matter of education again, We have deprived ourselves, in effect, of a language that allowed us to talk in terms like that, whether or not they were specifically questions of belief, whether, Anyway, it's my belief, of course, that you find the Bible full of hope, full of the generosity of God and his loyalty to us who are not loyal to him, But I'm simply speaking, I'm saying something that perhaps finds no resonance. I don't know if it does or not, One of the things that's amazing about anyone who spoke publicly in the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln being a great example, is that they could use these huge resonances of biblical allusion, and people understood it. And this is true right up to Martin Luther King, I mean, he drew right on, on that very tradition. And in those days, people didn't have to agree with him, but they knew what he was saying, And that's something that I think that, it's only the responsibility of the churches to teach that sort of thing. But we got a lot of churches in this country.
Yeah, no, I agree. And when I preach, I assume no knowledge. So that there are people who are listening to what I have to say, and I have to figure out how to get very quickly to the essence of a story and yet give enough context so that there's a way into the sacred texts. And attention spans being what they are, I can't count on people being willing to engage the whole biblical canon so that I can place a particular story in its context. I have to do that kind of on the spot. And it's a shame, and it will require, as I think you said, just a sort of a lifetime of instruction and also an appreciation of why it matters, like why these stories can change your life, like what it means to have a sense of the power of the miracle of the loaves and fish. Like, why is that such a great story? Or the Noah story that you were describing. Like, these aren't just stories, these are ways of giving language and metaphor to our experiences that can allow us to be brave in moments when we're afraid, right? I think that's their point. They're there to help us. Peter's walking on the water and he sinks. Like, who can identify with that? Who can identify with trying to do something that you couldn't do and not being able to do it, right? And having someone say, oh, you foolish one, here, let me help you. And there, that's the power, but it does require, and all of us who are grandparents ought to think about this, like as many times as we can, how we can bring stories, these amazing, wonderful stories, into the lives of those coming up behind us, because there has been that collapse, at least for many. I mean, if you have a private school education, perhaps not, but for many in our country, the education system isn't going to do it. So we have to reform the system, but also do our part.
Marilynne, you also connected this act in one of your essays to community, that the act of imagination isn't just about art, and it's not just about storytelling, and it's not specific to religion, certainly, or literature, but that our whole way of understanding our life together depends on the imagination. What were you getting at when making that connection?
Well, it's the strangest thing, and I've wondered about it. Why, when something so arbitrary as the boundaries of the United States of America, there, somebody drew that with a pencil, you know what I mean? But if a child is on one side of the boundary, north or south, I feel an obligation. I feel incriminated by a deficiency in that child's experience that I can, I don't feel in the same way if that child is across an arbitrary boundary. It's the imagination that we really are one thing, that Americans they cohere, they have shared acknowledged values, shared acknowledged rights, that are like a household, where customs customs are different, diets are different, all the rest of it. But there is, if there is such a thing as America, I, as an American, have an obligation to that thing, And that's an imaginative act. From the point of view of God Almighty or something, it probably makes very little sense. But nevertheless, you have to set boundaries to your obligations, because your adequacy to them is always limited. The limits always have to be highly porous, You have to be able to reimagine other people, if that's appropriate, from one time to another, and so on. I mean, it's just a kind of a fallback to say, I'm responsible for the freedom of American people. I'm responsible for their safety. I'm responsible for their learning. I'm responsible for their health. This is all an act of imagination. There's a certain sense in which no country exists. It's only spilling over populations from one side to another and so on. Even the idea of a nation is a slightly dangerous idea, Nevertheless, when I worry about the Supreme Court, it's because of its impact specifically on this strange rectangle that we inhabit, In the same way, if I'm living in a town and I hear that there are people that are not being adequately fed, it's disgusting to me. It's like saying you've got somebody trapped in your attic or something, I mean, there simply are obligations that are an aspect of imaginative identification, These people, I cannot say of them, they are not my responsibility,
Which gets to, in terms of community proximity, and I think we all have something to answer for there, in terms of where we live, with whom do we live, how are we, to use the Harry Potter phrase, sorted into different communities of similar affluence, point of view, world experience, and the impact that has if we aren't able to find ways to be close enough to one another that we actually know each other and have a sense of different experiences. And I think, you don't need me to tell you that that dynamic has exacerbated tremendously in the last 30 to 40 years in our country, that there was more, apart from acute segregation, there was more class balance, and there was more of rubbing of people who didn't have the same life experience or worldview that you had. And so I think we have some rebuilding to do that may require of any of us a willingness to stretch ourselves. I try to do this as often as I can with limited success, but to try to find myself in a place or a worldview or a life experience that I do not share, and simply be there, not necessarily argue or judge or help, but be there and see what I can learn. And maybe that's part of the process too, is relearning what it means to be part of this country and largely the world. It's a humbling time, I don't want to, but it also ought to, I don't know, our forebears have done astonishing things at crucible moments, right? The human species has done really, really remarkable things at life nodal moments. And what if it's one of those moments? And what if there's some small way that any one of us can join with the life-giving Spirit of God and help, not just incrementally, but perhaps even somewhat dramatically, or it'll feel dramatic even though it was like 1,000 million incremental steps, but when it happens, it's going to feel like that, that final push. And I don't know, I want to be there for that, but if I'm not, I'll be part of the incremental movements to that time. And trust in the promises that God gives us, that is in fact God's desire for us to be whole and well, and for all human beings and all creatures to thrive. I'd rather live with that as my vision than not,
We'll go soon to questions that you have from the audience, but before we do, I was urged to ask each of you just to answer a very specific question. What specifically should we do in this moment, or what do you personally feel called to do in this moment?
What who should do? What you should do, what I should do,
Well, the suggestion was that
yeah.
that this way of considering things tends to the abstract, and
right.
how can we make a more pointed recommendation for action? I'm not sure I entirely go along with it, but
well, I love this question because it forces all of us to take stock of who we are and where we are. Like, where are we in the arc of life? Where are we in the fabric of our relationships? What's being asked of us? What resources are available to us? What challenges and struggles are in our world? And then ask the question that I think Governor Duvall said, what one thing, or what seems to be being summoned out of me now? And it can't be a universal thing. There may be a few things that will join together, many things perhaps, but we have to start with our own lives and who and where and what is true for us. What is your giftedness? What is mine? What is the universe in which we dwell? And take responsibility for it. I get that question a lot. Why aren't we all in the streets? Well, I don't know. I'm not in the streets. So what am I? What should I be doing? That's for me to answer. And I think if we let that question just sit in our spirits, as I think Jung said, the next right thing will be revealed to us. The next right thing. And if we do that, the next right thing might come after that, but we may not get the whole picture, And I feel like that's a life of faith, that I will be given sufficient guidance for the day, and a desire, if I state it before God, a desire to be part of the rising, and that I will be led to that discerning. But I may not have the answer for you, because I don't know enough about you and your context, but you could come to that clarity with time and conversation and prayer, and your next right thing would be revealed to you.
So Marilynne, you've had such a gift for writing essays of great subtlety and complexity, but that also carry a direct question. What kind of country do we want? What does it mean to love a country? So the last word here is yours. What should be done? What should we be doing, or what is Marilynne Robinson going to be doing right now?
Well, Marilynne Robinson is going to be writing and speaking, and But I just have a feeling of so much power in the population, I think that, that if people could kind of coalesce, could understand together many things, certain essential things, I don't know what rising up would mean, but I think that the people would know what it meant if the moment came, well, I've talked about this before, but you see these big institutions sort of seem to topple, like Columbia, Harvard, and so on. And you think, how many graduates of those places are there in the population? And what kind of leverage do they have? Lots, many. Those are the... But they're quiet. They're as quiet as anybody else in the population, If you multiply that by all the people who have identified in one way or another with the major institutions in this country, it's a fantastic implicit power, And we have to learn how to say no. We have to learn how to say thus far and no farther, Nobody has power now except the people. The country there is no salvation for democracy except democracy, And that's what, that's what I hope for.
So I'm figuring that microphones are being set up right now, and if you have a question, come to the front, and keep it short and keep it a question, I'd say.
Hi, I'm Gerald, and just specifically, I'm wondering how you feel and if there's anything you can do about people who are preaching in Christian churches across the country and supporting some of the things that the administration is doing and actually encouraging some of the negative behaviors that we're all afraid of.
If I understand you, are you asking me?
Well, actually, both, yes. Using pulpits to actually promote behaviors that are harmful to our democracy.
Right.
And what you can do individually, and Marilynne, what you might suggest we can do or you can do to call that out and make a difference in that.
We call it Christian nationalism now. It's a relatively recent phrasing, as I understand it, but the phenomenon is not new, which is the distortion or the distortion of Christian teaching from the pulpits across this country and the world. And I, think of the justifications of all the things that we now, as a society, have rejected that were justified by pulpits throughout our history. We can't silence them, and these are people who, many of whom sincerely believe what they believe and have they have the ascendant voice now, and they're backed by a lot of political power. And so in terms of what to do, it's a little bit like David and Goliath. There isn't anything that can be done power for power, but perhaps there are ways that the winsome alternative or the merciful, loving alternative will ultimately have its response. But like Jesus on the cross, it may not look like it for a while. There are times when the more powerful prevail. And the question is, as we're alongside that, how not to demonize whole swaths of people that we happen to disagree with, and what I try to do is to penetrate that world with conversation and relationship, curiosity, and a witness that doesn't fight, but listens and then tries to embody what I believe to be true. I don't know any other way to do it that isn't violent, and I'm not. That's my imperfect response, but that's what I would say.
What I would dream of as a response is simply the creation of a very positive, scripturally sound Christianity, you know? I mean, it's the thing we always do. We let one side completely take over the stage, you know? We let one side take over the vocabulary. And then, of course, that gives them a tremendous power. But that, in a sense, that's not their fault. You know, we're supposed to produce our side of the conversation, which we do not do. Characteristically, we don't do. And so it rests with us, really, to present to people another way of looking at things, another way of understanding Christian tradition, and so on. You know, it's a lot of work and so on. It will be not the easiest thing in the world to find points of entry and so on. Nevertheless, I believe in the idealism of young people. I think that one of the earliest impulses that they have is generosity. And I think that if we have the right and we have the history and we have the vocabulary to appeal to them on this utterly legitimate basis, and I think we fail to do that, you know. So, you know, the ball is in our court, you know. We certainly have no business trying to, you know, limit other people's religious expression or anything. That's not the point. You know, the point is to express an authentic, profoundly felt and acted upon Christianity for our own, as an expression of our own being.
Thank you.
Hello. It's a great honor to meet you, see you both. Thank you for being here. My question, Ms. Robinson, relates to your interview with President Obama, which I've read many times. And one line has stayed with me, and I've thought about it a lot, where you said, if I could strike one word from the English vocabulary, it would be competition. And I'm wondering what your updated thoughts, I know that was a long time ago, but what are your thoughts about competition?
Well, you know, what I was thinking about specifically then was international competition. Every time another country begins to flourish, we begin to treat it as an antagonist, you know? I mean, like if you look at the history of China, those people have had a very hard scrabble existence, time out of mind. That, I mean, this was intrinsically true, and then they had the imperialisms of Britain and so on to impoverish them all over again, you know? I mean, to the extent they could be impoverished. We should thank God if this is a time when all of those people have enough to eat and have a reasonable hope for a life of a kind that they would find exciting and gratifying. They've waited a long time, you know? And if we stopped investing to build factories in China in order to exploit underpaid Chinese, we could invest that money here, and we would let the entirely capable Chinese flourish on their own, and be glad for their prosperity. There was a time in the history of this country where we thought that encouraging prosperity in other countries was a good thing. It would produce peace, and so it was part of the theory behind NATO, And now it's just like, Ireland has its moment, and we say, the Celtic tiger, we've got to gear up and defeat Ireland. What are we, it's ridiculous, and it's such a tick. Or the little Pacific Rim countries, let them flourish. They're not threatening us. There's plenty to go around, Anyway, that's what I mean by hating competition. I think that we ought to be able to look at other countries, see them flourish, and say, thank God.
And maybe not rob all their natural resources. Just saying.
Hi, I've really enjoyed both of your remarks. You touched a lot in the beginning on ideas of empathy and courage. Both of those have a specific relationship to the way masculinity is constructed in this country. And I see our current situation as being directly related to the sort of, in scare quotes, soft masculinity of President Obama, President Biden, and of Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris. And I'd be interested in hearing both of your thoughts. In traditional American masculinity, empathy is not valued. Empathy is devalued. Courage is looked at as physical courage, courage to be in a physical fight and defend your family and enemies, against enemies. I'd really love to hear both of your thoughts on how we can have a better form of masculinity moving forward. Or if you even think I'm right, I don't know.
We're both mothers of sons, fine men, all of them. I don't know. Frankly, when I was a child, because I am so old, all doctors were male. I was dealt with kindness, imagination, sympathy by these male doctors. I don't think I'd never heard anyone criticize them on the basis of their having gender attitudes that were in any sense a reduction of the quality of the care that they gave anyone I knew. I think that it's, when women enter into these other roles in life, and there's a flood of talent that comes into them, a flood of energy, a flood of insight. But I don't think that means that we have to say nothing good happened before, or that no one good was active before. I had a father who was a classic example of the silent man, very gentle. No one whose gentleness I trusted more profoundly than his, I just can't feel that we're not dealing in an exaggeration of perhaps a slightly, I just don't, you know what I mean? Men have been very important in my life in very generous roles and very instructive roles, and it is not honest for me to speak dismissively of them.
I was in no way even trying to imply that. I was talking about masculinity as a construction, right, as a social construction that doesn't value empathy. Your example of physicians, that is a profession that's become increasingly feminized over the years because it is looked at as a softer emotional profession, and men are less attracted to it. Nursing, clergy, all of these professions, this has happened, they've become more feminized. and the definition of masculinity seems to have gotten, again, I'm talking about a traditional definition that is not my definition, not your definition, but just what American masculinity is supposed to be. It seems to have gotten narrower in my lifetime. It seems to have become that you're really, to be a real man, you're supposed to be, you know, not have empathy and be sort of a bully. I mean, look at our president. He's looked at as quite masculine. So, I don't know, just thoughts.
Yeah, there is something in the culture now that has swung toward a kind of intensely identified masculine culture, and there's, I think the podcasting world is where this is most evident, and the nature of the following around some of the male figures that are promoting a more, I don't want to say necessarily aggressive, but unapologetically male, and the interesting framing is that as if masculinity has been under siege, right? As if masculinity has been threatened. And I think, frankly, there's some truth to that. I think there's some truth to that. And I worry about, I wouldn't necessarily call it the feminization of the clergy, but I want male clergy. And right now I have to strategize and prioritize male candidates for ministry, right? Because overwhelmingly, women are presenting themselves for the clergy, and fewer men are. And I want robust, healthy male role models in the clergy. So I just pay attention to that, right? And I have the luxury of doing that because I'm the bishop. And I want, but I think your point is well taken. And yeah, and I would ask the men in the room to speak up, because it's not my lane. But I do think about it, and I think you're onto something. I just don't want us to become I think we all have to be careful not to overly caricature what we don't like and don't fully understand, right? It's a warning for all of us. If you're going to criticize, try first to understand. And it's amazing. You're not going to, I'm not going to, but it's amazing what you learn when you take off that blinder and that fear and just try to listen. It's not easy, but if we don't do that, we are simply mirroring back the problem that we decry. Yeah. So we all have work to do on that front.
Thank you. We have time for one last question.
Hi there. My question is about physical church spaces. There are physical church spaces and church communities. So here in New England, most people are not going to church at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning anymore, and most people are not going to hear allusions to the Bible in a speech like they could 70 years ago and understand it. So I'm wondering what you're seeing in your faith communities and in physical church spaces that are giving you hope toward these action-based changes in our society, and also things that you're seeing happening in physical church spaces and in church communities that are action-oriented.
Well, it seems as if that's sort of your sort of question, right?
Well, for you too, because
I really wanted to hear Marilyn's opinion about that. But you said that your church was thriving now.
Yes, it seems to be flourishing. But frankly, I belong to the church in Iowa City for about 30 years. I was very, entrenched in what was going on there and very supportive of it. It was 150-something years old and so on, right by the university, But then I moved away, and now I am embarrassed to admit that I participate in that church on video and have not found an actual physical church to belong to. I think this is not ideal, although I do love to be able to watch it from such a distance. There they all are, singing their hearts out.
It's a thing. That you are not alone. I would say, in my tradition, the Episcopal Church, we have a lot of property that is misaligned to the mission needs of their communities. They were built in different eras, they had different purposes, they had different architecture. I mean, think of this, like this building, I'm assuming it was renovated at some point. Those of you who live in old houses, I assume you renovated your kitchens and updated, we just have a lot of property that is ill-suited now for the context in which we live. It's very expensive. These are historic properties, a lot of them, and we have painstakingly a lot to do. We also, some of us have endowments, which is great, but we also have to get into a mindset, and this is hard, but what does the community need? What does the community need? And when we ask that question and walk around and get to know the community as it is now, and ask what the felt needs are and what our spaces might do to help serve that need, the answers come. And with a vision, the money comes. But there's no shortcuts to that. And so when I see examples of it, I praise God, and I just know there's a lot of work ahead. And a lot of churches are being turned into pubs and apartment complexes and are being raised for other things. And some of that's heartbreaking, but we also are, we have to figure that out kind of property by property and try to create spaces and communities that are compelling and inviting and make a difference in people's lives. And if they don't, we're just boring them, right? I mean, the number one reason the two reasons people tell me they don't go to church is either A, the hypocrisy, or the boredom. And that's on me. I mean, I feel that. And if our churches are boring, why would anyone want to come? So, but the gospel's not boring. And the tradition and the faith isn't boring. So, yeah, so there's hope, but we've got some work to do. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
This has been such an invigorating conversation. I hope it will take it out onto Main Street and out to our communities. Thank you, Bishop Mariann. Thank you, Marilynne. And thank you to the Authors Guild Foundation.